Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Good Grief, Connecticut. We are presenting to you live from Adams House this morning, and of course, we're taking the proper precautions and social distancing in the house due to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Located in Shelton, Connecticut, Adams House, as you can see, is a beautiful Victorian building, and here, the comforting home-like setting offers free grief support to children and their families who've experienced the loss of a loved one. Through education and its Healing Hearts program, Adams House offers a weekly closed peer support group geared towards children ages 5 to 18. I'm Mercedes Valgott, and this morning we're going to have a candid conversation about grief and about loss. And of course, this is an important and timely topic to be discussing today. As Connecticut businesses slowly reopen, residents slowly reemerge from quarantine, we all seem to know a colleague, a friend, or a neighbor who has lost a loved one during the pandemic. What do you say to them? How do you show your support without saying the wrong thing? How do you help them without unlocking your own feelings of anxiety and grief? In some ways, it feels like grief is everywhere. In fact, I just recently read a study showing that for every COVID-19 death, there are 9 close family members who are left to grieve. And with more than 4,400 COVID-19 deaths here in Connecticut alone, that is nearly 40,000 of our friends and neighbors who are in mourning. And of course, that impact's substantial. It affects people of all ages and all walks of life. But certainly for all the pandemic has taken from us, it has also given us a unique opportunity. It's given us a chance to talk freely and openly about an extremely difficult personal subject that most of us keep quiet about. And that subject, of course, is grief. So throughout the next hour, we'll be having some candid conversations about grief and loss with 2 leaders in the field, Allison Wysota, the executive director and founder of Adams House, and licensed therapist Caitlin Iannucci. And they'll be sharing practical advice from what they've learned directly through their work, through their practice, through their personal experience. So of course, please join us in this conversation with your questions. You can add them to the comment section on this live Facebook stream. And if you're enjoying this event, please do help us spread the word by hosting a watch party or inviting your friends to join the conversation, and of course, sharing the stream within your own networks. And as a reminder, we will also have an encore presentation of this webinar on the Adams House website at noon today. Now, just a little bit about our format. We've opted for an Ask Me Anything format, so please don't hold back. We want you to lean in deep. These 2 experts are here to help you in this judgment-free space known as Good Grief, Connecticut. And with that, let's get started. Allison is the founder of Adams House and the Adam Wysota Foundation. Allison, there's a very personal story behind Adams House. Can you share that story with us?
Sure. So sadly, about 8 years ago on May 6th, my husband Adam passed away suddenly, died of a heart attack following a tennis game. So very unexpected. I had my 3 sons at the time were 11, 15, and 18. And, they all mourned really differently. They went through their grief battles. And the one thing that they expressed was and it was difficult to find, was the ability to talk with other kids about what they were going through, the kids their age, how they were coping. And I found 1 or 2 things that were helpful. But as an educator, and my background as a teacher and a speech pathologist, I'm all about the lesson plan. I wanted them to have a plan, a strategy. I wanted them to learn tools to cope with their loss and almost make them feel empowered with the loss. I wanted them to reverse their idea of grief, that instead of this was happening to me, I wanted them to know that they could push back on grief and they could examine ways to do that. And this, through my education and through my different educational settings, I knew peer support would be invaluable here. No one wants to listen to their parent. We don't know anything. And, when a kid says something, even though it's the same thing an adult said, they listen and they engage. And that's really where the idea of Adams House began. And as a family, we set out to make it a reality. It was really important, and the kids expressed this, my sons expressed this, that the setting be a house. It should feel like they're coming to a friend's house. And so 8 years later, we sit here after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and it is definitely the house that Adam helped build. And I have no doubt that he had a hand in getting us here today.
Absolutely. He was an intellect, he had an amazing sense of humor, and I think he'd be extremely proud of the help that you are offering to children and their families who are grieving. We're also joined by Caitlin Iannucci. Caitlin is a licensed professional counselor and board certified registered art therapist practicing in Shelton. Caitlin specializes in grief and in trauma. She's also a certified compassionate bereavement care provider and adjunct faculty at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven. And Caitlin is also the president-elect of the Connecticut Art Therapy Association. Caitlin, good morning. You call your clients brave hearts. Why brave hearts?
Yes, good morning, Mercedes. The idea of reaching out for help is scary and intimidating to a lot of people. That idea of doing the digging, opening up, not really knowing what's going to come up. You're indeed brave in that moment of reaching out for help. I also think that referring to potential clients or anyone seeking help as someone who is a brave heart or who has a brave heart imparts a sense of compassion. And I think, as you'll see throughout our talk today, it's a very important stance to take as a supporter and as someone who is grieving as well. Self-compassion and compassion for others. I also just want to thank Allison for the opportunity to be here today. We've worked closely together, collaboratively supporting program families in our community, and Allison has created such a presence. So I'm grateful for that.
Me too,
Caitlin.
Me
all
too.
We've been talking about this very unprecedented pandemic that we've been living with, which has brought so many different kinds of grief. I mean, we are all grieving the loss of family, perhaps. We're definitely grieving the loss of our own communities, our jobs, the lives we lived before the coronavirus and before COVID-19. And of course, so many of us also dealing with the loss of friends and family at a time where all those rituals, having a funeral or attending the funeral, has just changed so dramatically. I mentioned to Allison and Caitlin that I lost my mother-in-law in March, and very early days of the pandemic. And it was hard. It was, our world was ending, my husband's world was ending, and yet we couldn't have a priest. We couldn't have, they only allowed 7 people in the funeral home. We thankfully made a very beautiful and intimate send off for my mother-in-law. And thankfully the priest came to the cemetery, but it was really, really hard not to have that support. Caitlin, how has COVID-19 affected how we grieve during this time?
Yeah, certainly. On top of grieving collectively, all that you've mentioned, grieving the loss of a loved one is further complicated at this time. We're coming off the heels of a significant time of isolation, and support looks and feels different right now. As you mentioned with your story about losing your mother-in-law at that time, limited physical support and social support. Support looks and feels different, and it's still there. We just have to seek it out and acknowledge that the delivery and the methods of it are going to just look and feel different. We have to adapt to our circumstances. We've all been called to do that at some point, and grievers especially are being called to do that right now, adapt as best we can. The help is out there. Certainly there's all different types of support, but again, it's going to look and feel different. Clinically, telehealth has taken over as far as meeting the needs, the mental health needs of a lot of clients. So the support is there, it just looks and feels different. Acknowledging that is very important for everyone seeking help, but especially grievers, because of the loss of what we are used to on top of the loss of a loved one.
Mm-hmm. Allison, what are you seeing with your families who are going through programs here at Adams House during these last few months?
Yeah, so when we went into quarantine here in Connecticut, there were 11 families in program. So anxiety is a very main, real emotion that we see in group, especially from children who are already coping the death of one parent, and now you have this coronavirus that threatens the life of their surviving parent. Our program quickly moved on to Zoom for those kids, so and the parents alike. We were able to offer some support during this time when they were feeling very isolated from their friends and their support system. Interestingly enough, they wanted to wait for graduations for when we could be in person. And so we recently held that outside, implementing all our PPE protocol. And it was nice for everybody to be together, but what was very evident was how anxious everyone still is about being present in a group. So we have many families waiting to attend. And again, many of them feel too vulnerable to attend in person. Grief and loss is a difficult challenge. And now this is just compounded by the virus. Parents even, continue to call, and we set up an initial meeting, and I usually give them the choice in person or on Zoom. And the majority still choose to meet on Zoom, in that, to keep themselves safe. I understand that.
We've been talking about grief and the way it really affects all of us. Grief is absolutely universal. It's an overwhelming emotion that most of us have experienced, but it's also very personal. Caitlin and Allison, you both said it's very personal. No one grieves exactly the same way. We have a question coming in from Facebook, and the question is from Tanya. She says, do you subscribe to the 5 stages of grief approach in grief counseling? And do you find that a person's spiritual beliefs actually influence grief? Caitlin, I guess I'll turn this one over to you to start.
Sure, yeah. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is credited with developing the stages of grieving that I think our culture for the most part is familiar with, right? We've heard of the shock, denial, anger, bargaining, guilt, depression, reconstruction, and acceptance. And although that model has certainly helped a lot of people, and it's helped our society somewhat to talk about death, I actually subscribe to a more fluid model, such as J.W. Worden's tasks of grief, where there's more wiggle room between these tasks. And it also implies that it's not linear. Grief feels incredibly messy. It's not necessarily steps down in a linear fashion. And there's often no end point. Right? Grief can feel like this. It's not necessarily like this. Okay. So, for example, J.W. Worden's tasks of grieving, accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain, adjusting to a world without our loved one, and then ultimately maintaining a connection to this person. You can see how one might kind of bounce around between those in the early stages and also in the later stages of grieving. So I ascribe to a more fluid model, and there are so many different models that we can use to help us through our grieving journeys. But I do find that a more fluid model is inherently validating for the people who I work with, and it just feels like a better fit. But that's not the case for everyone, and gratefully, we have many different models that we can explore.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we even in program, we actually talk about a couple of different models, but the one we use primarily is Leslie Delp's bereavement process. And Leslie Delp is the founder of Olivia's House. Our program is adopted from them. They're our mentors. We're here because of their kindness to share their wisdom and their guidance and their support of our new program. But we discuss the process really not as a map. It really just is some loose framework to normalize the messy grief work. And grief is so messy. But with that knowledge, you kind of give our families permission to bounce around, to have setbacks, and so that they're viewed not as a failure, because we have this idea that we can get grief right. And, there isn't a right way. There's a right way for you. And that sometimes that it involves a lot of setbacks. And so rather than viewing them as a failure to get grief correct, it's just they can embrace that it is part of the process.
The second part of Tanya's question is, what would you like to see our society do differently with regard to the grieving process?
Yeah, I know personally as a provider, I would love to move away from pathologizing grief. I think it imparts a very unfair timeline on our grievers. We need to look at it as universal human suffering instead of something that's clinical in nature. We all grieve, and we all grieve in different ways. And I think too, weaving in some amount of spirituality, depending on who they are as a person, is really important. It's kind of that idea of meeting them where they're at and exploring their beliefs around spirituality. I would love to see more general acceptance of that. Spirituality, and it's a lens through which we explore death, dying, and grieving. So I think it's really important to incorporate that and acknowledge that with our grievers if we're going to be compassionate supporters. But overall, yes, let's move away from pathologizing grief.
Yeah. And I'd add, even from the spirituality angle, a lot of our families, that is something that they now revisit, and some lean into their faith as a true, helper in their grief process. And it's where they draw their strength and support. Others are very angry at God, and it challenges their religious beliefs. How do a God that I love do this? And so there's a lot that they work through. And, as far as what I would love to see society do, I would love to say lose the timeline, especially in, we have this weird, I give this griever a year and then everything should be back to normal. So I would love to see that gone, especially in light of COVID, with everything being delayed and mourning tasks are being delayed and grieving in public and grieving in their family circles have been delayed. But I also think it's important, if you're supporting a griever, that while you tend to look at the death of the person as what that griever has to process, you have to look at there's a whole slew of subsequent losses that are important to keep in mind. Loss of expectation is devastating. They expected to grow old with that person. They expected to walk their daughter down the aisle. So that's a big piece. Loss of security, loss of income, loss of sleep. So many, we grapple with so many sleep disorders following the loss, myself included. And it is hard to do anything without sleep. And I'm not talking about one night's sleep. You're talking about months on end of not sleeping. Loss of friends and family. Friends fall away, and so do family members. And it affects your self-worth, your confidence, loss of one's identity, loss of health, loss of faith. So in addition to that, they're missing their person, they're yearning for their person. So it's really important for the supporter to look at the griever as this is a period of reconstruction. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. They're rebuilding a life, and they didn't ask to rebuild this life, but they're left to do just that. So don't take the timeline away, because anyone who's built anything ever, even a project in their house, know how slow that process is. And really show up without criticism and judgment. Don't say, like, I wouldn't do it this way. Practice empathy and compassion. That is what the grievers in your life need.
Allison, we all want to be empathetic, supportive. We want to be good friends to those who have lost loved ones. But sometimes it can be really awkward or really uncomfortable to find, just the right words. Why is it so hard for us to talk about grief?
I mean, there's so many reasons, but the big one is fear. We are fearful of feeling the feelings. We work really hard at avoiding pain and sadness and anger. And, death now happens behind the closed doors of nursing homes and hospitals. Back in the day, death happened at home and we were all able to, kind of be comfortable with it. But the way it happens now, we can avoid it. And so we're not good at it. And these feelings are uncomfortable. They don't feel good. Social media outlets support that notion that we really shouldn't feel the hard stuff. Let's just present all the good that's happening. And so we start to have this notion that feelings are good and bad and positive and negative, rather than just taking them for what they are, important feelings. And in grief, those feelings, it's super important that those feelings be acknowledged, because it's all necessary to get through the healing process. And then we're just fearful of saying the wrong thing and just let's say it for what it is. You're probably going to say the wrong thing. The griever goes through so many pitfalls and hills and valleys. It's hard to keep track. So don't worry about saying the perfect thing. You know, being there, being present, being there with a hug, a touch of a hand, a phone call are all comforting before a single word is even said. So take the pressure off yourself. You're not going to have, there's no perfect words. There is nothing you could say that is going to take away the pain of someone losing someone they've loved. And then you have to just be careful too, when we all kind of tend to do it, is, you know, you're an expert in your own grief. It doesn't make you an expert in theirs. So be careful of offering what worked for you in a strong way. Wait for the advice to be asked. Don't offer it. And listening seems so inactive, but really, honestly, it is the best thing, really, really listening and almost giving back what you heard them say. Know that they're being heard is the nicest gift you can give someone bereaved. And then there's fear of being vulnerable, right? It makes us look at our own mortality, and you know, no one likes that. And there's also some, I mean, I can tell from my own ceremony that many adults in my community have very unresolved feelings about a death that happened in their own life. So when another loss happens, you tend to bring those forward, and you know, you have to you're fearful of losing control of your own emotions. And so we have a pressure to be strong and stoic for the family grieving. But, you know, we tell people you're not superheroes, be human. You know, everyone appreciates that you're having a hard time. Be communicative about why you're having a hard time. So those are, you know, fear of tears too. No one likes to make someone cry, but we here at Adam's House, and any graduate would tell you, we love tears here at Adam's House. Tears are super important. They're, you know, it releases a chemical. It's nature's way of releasing that tension that's in your body. You know, crying makes people feel better emotionally and physically. So I would love if we changed the view that we have of tears. I also, it's become like a little bit of a debate, but I will never hand you a tissue because that signals to the bereaved that I want you to stop. And so I'll offer that there's a tissue available, but I won't hand it to you because we say, let it flow. Don't be afraid of the tears.
That was all wonderful advice, Allison. Let's do a little bit of sort of go through some, because certainly grieving, as you said, is not the same in every situation. So we have coworkers, we have friends, we have dear friends, we have family members. Let's go through some scenarios in terms of how to comfort a coworker. Caitlin?
Sure. So a good guide for offering support is the idea of meeting people where they're at. You can very easily communicate interest or acceptance of how they're grieving just by showing up for that person. For a coworker, there might be an amount of pressure to resume, you know, with work and perform to the same level that they were prior to the loss. So a simple gesture of being with that person, maybe offering to share lunch with that person, talking about their loved one, using their loved one's name if you have that kind of relationship with your coworker, that can impart acceptance and empathy rather than avoidance. So I want to speak a little bit to avoidance here. Avoidance can be very painful for the bereaved. So the idea of showing up, while it might feel small, right? We always want to do more. But the idea of showing up rather than avoiding can be tremendously helpful to the bereaved. You can invite conversation about what it's like for them to be back to work. We might assume the wrong thing. We might assume, oh, maybe it's a good distraction for them. Maybe it's really difficult for them to be there. So invite their perspective on it, validate their feelings without bringing the conversation back to you, and avoid comparing their experience to your own losses unless they do initiate that conversation in an effort to connect with you.
So that's the situation of a coworker. Allison, how about someone who's closer, a friend? How would you offer comfort and support to a friend?
Sure. I mean, I know I would speak to what we see in program a lot with our program families. You know, a lot of them get really disappointed and upset that their family, their friends don't talk about their person. And, you know, to Caitlin's point, you know, avoiding that person. So I would say talk to them directly. And if you're not sure, ask. You know, I was thinking about, you know, your wife today, and I thought of this funny story, open to hearing about it. And, you know, and take the cues from the bereaved, you know, help them make plans. Giving them a plan often makes the griever obviously feel thought of, but also kind of gives them some control, that there's some order to this very chaotic landscape of grief. You know, rituals are important. If you're a close friend, you can kind of help, you know, develop some, or kind of brainstorm some ideas to, you know, it's very important for children and families to figure out that alternate way of connection to their loved one. And I would say a lot of friends get very personally insulted by the no. So don't take a no to an invitation personally, especially if it's 3 no's in a row. It doesn't mean they don't want to see you. It just means that it is very hard for that person to have the energy to get out, go to a lunch, go to a walk, you know, keep at it, you know, stay with it, you know, shelve the sensitivity. You know, one of the things that we talk about actually in the last group that came up was this idea of spoons. And I really like it, which is basically spoons are energy units. So you can ask your friend, how many spoons do you have? You know, how many spoons do you think you need to go to lunch? Okay, if it's 10 spoons, then you could just ask your friend, do you have enough spoons for lunch today? So instead of just making it, you know, icky, you can kind of have this conversation about spoons. So, you know, avoid the let me know if you need anything. That just puts the burden on the griever. You know, if you're a great friend, just say, I'm coming by Tuesday. And then once you get there, what do you need me to do today? You need a load of laundry done? You want me to run to the store? You want me to carpool, light housekeeping? How can I help you right this minute? Because the griever is not going to reach out to, you know, I don't know, I'm Irish Catholic. It comes with a lot of guilt. So I would never reach out and ask you to do my laundry. So, you know, make those offers to your friends.
The other thing that's really difficult is when we're talking about the loss of a child, or if one of your children loses a friend. Allison or Caitlin, how do we comfort them?
Yeah.
Same way.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah.
I'm talking a lot.
No, it's okay. You know, as far as supporting children who are grieving, the important thing is to just pay attention to their language. We really need to meet them where they're at in terms of how they are expressing what they need to express. And we can always find ways to additionally support their expressions of grief, right? And we can do that creatively through art or play. Play with the kids. Okay. And a lot of times kids will reenact themes of, you know, death, dying, grieving, and that's our opportunity to listen. There's a message underneath there. Okay. So we need to listen in more than one way. Allison, I don't know if you want to speak more to, you know, supporting children specifically.
You know, kids ask a lot of questions. So, you know, if they've lost a sibling, they've lost a parent, you know, the questions are often the same, which is, you know, they wonder why it happened. They wonder about what, you know, what their loved one might have been thinking. They're worried they're going to forget their loved one. That is a really big one here at Adam's house. They don't want to forget, and they worried that they will. They want to know where they are, which is another big one, and it kind of speaks to how different we all are, because, you know, spirituality plays a role, the conversation about heaven, what heaven might look like. And then they want to know, you know, out of the mouth of babes, kids want to know why they don't talk about, you know, their loved one, you know, why did that all stop? And so they pick up on our messages that death is taboo. They definitely don't come, you know, with that. They learn that from the adults in their world. So if you want your child to talk about a loved one, you have to be prepared to talk about your loved one. If you avoid your feelings and avoid stories, they're going to avoid feelings and the stories. And, they need to know that they're safe and secure. They need to know, I know for our families here, they need to know that the surviving parent is taking care of themselves. And interestingly enough, sometimes our kids can't cry. And, we have that conversation. A lot of the bereavement processes talk about shock and numbness, and that's kind of across the board. When a death first happens, you're in shock and numbness. It is we all have this innate way of grieving. We are all built with that. And so that's just your body's way of protecting you from the intense feelings of grief, the overwhelming, intense pains of grief. And so, even kind of just educating the kids to this process gives them permission that it's okay, because they feel guilty. They feel terrible. Like, what's wrong with me? I loved my dad and I can't cry. So when they kind of know that is in play, it kind of gives them, some more permission to be okay with that part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would also add too that a lot of times we have to consider the developmental stage of the child.
For sure.
And so again, you'll probably hear us talk a lot today about meeting the griever where they're at, but it's especially true with children. A lot of times kids will form what we call like magical thinking about why a death happened. And so it's important to invite any questions that the child might have. Allison, like you said, kids have questions. Invite the questions. I can't emphasize that enough. We don't want to encourage children to keep questions inside by showing that we're uncomfortable entertaining their questions, because that's going to create anxiety, fear, confusion about grief and death in general. So invite the questions. And again, you don't have to give too much information.
Yeah.
Okay. And you don't have to be scant with your information, but that's where it's really going to take a little bit of like gut intuition on like how you meet that child and what they're needing in that moment, like what kind of information they need. Just meet them where they're at with that. Nothing more, nothing less, but use honest, frank terms. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't want to use terms like so-and-so went to sleep, because that can create additional fear and anxiety and confusion for the child. So be honest and frank about it.
And look, there's so much we as adults don't know about death and dying and what happens after, and we're all on that search. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. You're allowed to say, I don't know. You're not going to have all the answers here. And it's okay to say, you know what? I wondered about that too. I don't have an idea. So, be okay with that. I would say what a lot of bereaved parents do to children who have lost a sibling or a parent is that they've kind of removed the structures of discipline because they realize that they're in pain. And so suddenly they don't have to brush their teeth before bed. They don't have to do their homework. They don't have to, but it's important that these kids do feel like their world is spinning out of control. So those discipline markers are really, really important. They need them. They crave them. So it might seem counterintuitive, to still discipline them in the face of loss, but you want to still keep them accountable with some flexibility, especially when it comes to schools and homework. But you can't keep them, completely off the hook off of those things. And like Caitlin said, join them in playing. That's a big one. And one of the things that our kids bring up a fair amount in group is that they feel guilty playing, and they feel guilty going out with friends, and they feel guilty having fun in the face of a loss. And so, that's important for a parent to take that and give them permission to have fun, encourage them. You know what? Your brain needs a break from our grief work. Go have a good time. It's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have a question here from Catherine, and she says, how can I help my 35-year-old daughter who lost her husband to the coronavirus 6 weeks before their first anniversary?
I'll jump in here.
Yeah. Who's going first? You are?
I'll jump in.
Go, Caitlin.
So first of all, what I want to know is that there's going to be a parallel process here with grieving. It's very important, if you're going to be a supporter for your daughter, you also have to go through your own grieving process of this too. This could mean grieving your own expectations of what you thought your daughter would experience. Okay. Take her lead here. She will show you what she needs, and showing up and just listening can feel small, but it is such a big task. Okay. I think we have this inclination to want to fix, right? We just want to fix the situation, especially for our family members. But we can't take that grief away from them. I think it's going to be really important in this situation to hold space to grieve what could have been. So even in that silence, or even when words don't feel enough, that's going to be compassionate support. It's just holding that space for that to be explored.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add,
we certainly, go ahead, Allison, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to add, it's one of the resources that I'll talk about later. But here at Adams House, we follow Dr. Alan Wolfeld's philosophy of companioning. And companioning the bereaved is not about assessing or analyzing or fixing, but it's, or resolving. We tend to, especially moms, we want the fix, we want the resolution, we want to see where the finish line is. But it's really built on that model of like, teach me, show me what you need, so be the learner for the mom. It's like an interesting dynamic, right? Because you're so used to being the teacher, but now let your daughter be the teacher. And it's learning about just creating that safe space that you're willing to listen to the profound feelings of her loss. And, I wanted to share too, like even for a mom of 3 bereaved boys, I prided myself on having a plan B for everything. And I didn't have a plan B here, and I had to admit it. So, one of the things I could offer my boys were promises. And so, I promised that we'd be together as we would get through this, one day at a time as a family. I promised that their dreams were still intact, and that we would do anything we could to get them there. I promised to always tell them what their dad thought, because I actually knew him better than I knew myself. So, and I was careful never to wield it as a weapon. So I would say to this mom with this daughter, offer some promises. She's a young widow. Widows groups are going to be hard for her to find support. They tend to be an older demographic. And, your friends, if they're all coupled up, weekends become really difficult. So, promise to be her Saturday night, promise to, make a weekly plan with her, make her some promises that you're always going to listen. And you're going to let her show you the way.
Mm-hmm. So, we've been talking about how hard it is to talk about grief, but certainly there has to be sort of not a good scenario when we avoid talking about our grief.
Yeah. Well, I say it all the time here at Adams House. You can run, but you cannot hide from grief. You could push it down. And, typically what a lot of families get here, because they have pushed it down for so long, and it comes up in various forms. It can come out in, drinking in excess and binge eating and drug use. And, they're going, if you don't acknowledge, this is why I said earlier, the only way through healing is to acknowledge those feelings, as awful as they are. We tell our families, set a timer for like a minute and just sit with that profound sadness. But, we have our theme. You got to heal it. You got to feel it to heal it. So, and look, it doesn't even have to be drugs and alcohol. One piece of chocolate's comforting. An entire chocolate bar every night before bed is numbing. So we have to look and see what we're doing. But if we're numbing too long, then it is time for some kind of support. And, our friends and family, while they mean well, we tend to congratulate each other. And it looks like we're doing really well, and we're avoiding those feelings, and everything looks great. We have the stiff upper lip, but you really do have to become acquainted in your pain to get through to the other side and work through those difficult emotions.
Yeah, that idea of like,
actually,
no, I just want to jump in. Sorry, Mercedes.
Yeah.
But yeah, Allison brings up such a good point, in that we need to turn towards grief, and we need to be willing to sit with it, that idea of sitting with it. And I love that idea of just sitting with a timer. I'll often ask, what is it like to be with this feeling right now? Just hang out with this feeling, just for a little bit longer, and let's become curious about it rather than something that we feel we should be afraid of, because fear holds us back from really experiencing and feeling what we need to feel. And as Allison said, we need to feel it to heal it. So being willing to just turn towards it, lean into it rather than avoid it. Avoidance is a hard pattern to step out of, and feeling it is going to be uncomfortable, raw, vulnerable, painful. But set those limits around it, and it might not be as scary as we imagine it to be.
I had a question, that goes along with the conversation that we're having now. This question is from Lee, and it has to do with the idea of, it's hard enough to talk to others about grief, but how do you keep yourself from going down what she calls the rabbit hole of your own grief?
The rabbit hole. Yep. So I look at grieving as an invitation inward. It's a painful, raw invitation inward. And oftentimes when we sense that rabbit hole, it's a sign that there's bits and pieces of our grief that need to be explored, felt, processed, acknowledged, discovered, right? So we can experience a rabbit hole or a grief spiral, right? If our grief narrative feels disjointed or incohesive. So, and here's where I'm talking a little bit more about fear, as I was just talking about before. Fear encourages us to deny those bits and pieces or compartmentalize parts of our narrative because they hurt too much to explore or sit with. But if you can instead change that stance so that it becomes more about curiosity rather than fear, you're inviting that narrative, your grief story, to become integrated. And that's what we need to do. That's the real challenge in grief, is to integrate the whole narrative. Okay. So what are some ways to really do that? So I know I'm a little biased of my approach, and I take more creative approaches to expressing grief, right?
Yes.
But here's an example. I might encourage someone, regardless of age, to think about their grief. If it were a creature, what would it look like, sound like, feel like? If you sat next to it, what would you want to say to it? You see how that's a more stance of curiosity rather than fear. It's that idea of just listening to it and sitting with it and learning more about it. Sometimes I explore grief as a landscape. What does your grief landscape look like and feel like today? What's the climate? What does it sound like? And that landscape changes. And I think it supports the idea that our internal landscape changes, right? So the bottom line here is that we can encourage ourselves as grievers and others to become observers of that narrative and that experience, rather than experience grief as something that's happening to us.
I love the curious word. Curious, because as a supporter, be curious. I mean, if you walk away with anything today, walk away with being curious in the grief that's going on in the person you're trying to support.
Allison Lee had a second part to that question, and she says, how do you respond to people who say hurtful things that they think are helpful? So things like, she's in a much better place, or you'll get over this, you need to move on. How do we respond to those kinds of comments?
Oh, people are going to say the hurtful things. And I tend to remind people, that it is in a weird way trying to come from a good place, and it's their own uncomfortableness. But I kind of switched around a lot of those phrases that were said to me. And I added, I hope, I hope if he can't be here, he is in a better place. And, right now I don't see how, and I hope I can just get through today. But what I really should have said was, grief isn't fast and I'll never get over it, but I will find a way to live with it. And that is the truth. You never get over it, and it changes, but you do figure out, I call it like a dovetailing, even with my boys, figure out where your dad's loss and, fits in your life now. And you do have to find a home for it. So, look, there's going to be difficult times. There's going to be difficult things said, one at the service, but then long after the service, people are going to confront you and you're exhausted and you don't have time to be confrontational. So I say walking away is always an option. So if someone has said something really hurtful, walking away kind of says all you needed to say.
Yeah.
Allison.
Yeah. Allison, I think the way that you added, I hope, is just a really quick and just kind of easy way to handle a platitude. And a platitude, as some of you might be gathering right now, is just, it's a really well-meaning statement that I think we hear in our society all too often on how we think we should comfort a griever. But a platitude can be, it can feel very invalidating to the bereaved or dismissive. And so, I don't know, why don't we just talk about some common platitudes that we might hear? And I also want to add to, it doesn't make you a bad person if you've ever used one of these. This is a learning process in how to support grievers, right? So let's talk about some alternatives to platitudes. And so one that we might hear very often is everything happens for a reason. So how might we handle something like that or say it differently?
Yeah, don't say it at all. I mean, switch it around to just be like, I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm heartbroken that this happened to you. And I'm here to support you, moving forward. But yeah, that everything happens for a reason. What is unfortunate about that is grievers already come to the table thinking they did something to deserve this. And so they work through that. What did I do in my past life that made this happen? So I kind of think that just encourages that thought that everything happens for a reason and I must have did something to deserve it. So, switch it to, I'm sorry this happened. Yeah. But one of my favorites, this actually comes up in group a lot, that kids will often go up to a child that has lost a parent and said, I know how you feel, I lost my cat. And that just nothing infuriates them more, rightfully so. So be careful and, maybe not talk about your loss at the very moment when a person's in their intense throes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like another one that we hear often is, if you need anything, let me know.
Yeah. We talked about that before. Yeah.
Just puts too much pressure on the bereaved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When they're already feeling so depleted. Yeah.
And I don't really love, I'm sorry. And, we all say it, and I'm guilty of saying it too. But I kind of think it's only half the statement. So I'm sorry leaves you with the bereaved having to comfort you. The bereaved is going to feel like I have to now say to you, it's okay, I'm okay, and so, the thought of you comforting them has now been reversed. So, say, I'm sorry this death happened. I know you're devastated. I'm here I'm here to help, and, with the kids, with the groceries, with the carpooling, whatever you can offer. If you're a lawyer, say to help with paperwork. Being a widow, the paperwork is mind-boggling. So if you have a skill, offer that with your I'm sorry.
Yeah. We have another question from Raina. She says, I work with many elderly clients as a faith community outreach nurse. She says, many of my clients are suffering from chronic conditions and their spouses or family members are struggling to actually care for them emotionally and physically. They're anticipating this loss. However, they're grieving from the loss of what they imagine their life to be, and they experience guilt about that. How do I speak to that?
Yeah. I'll speak to anticipatory grief here. It is not discussed as often as what we think of when we hear the word grief. And I think this can really make it very complicated for anticipatory grievers. Often some very complex feelings, that idea of knowing what's going to happen, but also not knowing what it's going to be like. It can be very, very complicated. Guilt comes up. Can we normalize guilt as a reaction to grief, even anticipatory grief? Guilt doesn't have to feel or seem like a taboo discussion to have. We don't need to erase the guilt for the griever or even the anticipatory griever. I think oftentimes maybe our inclination might be, you don't need to feel guilty about that, but we don't need to take that away from them. Instead, let's invite the discussion. Maybe it is guilt for that person, right? And so a supportive, compassionate stance might be exploring what that feeling is. Maybe it's not, just guilt. Maybe it's other feelings complicated or, just kind of compounded around it, but invite the discussion around it so it doesn't feel taboo. And so it doesn't make that anticipatory griever feel even more isolated with a very complex situation. I guess my point here is that we can normalize that wide array or spectrum of feelings around anticipatory grief. And, if you really want to support someone who's in that circumstance, just normalize what they're feeling and be willing to hear it. Okay. Oftentimes our response or our reaction to someone else's guilt is that's our thing that we need to deal with. Right. So if we really want to support someone in that, we have to be willing to be a little uncomfortable with what might come up for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a second question here coming from Valerie. And Valerie says, what can I say to help those who are nearing death? So now it's not necessarily about the griever's loss or anticipatory, it's about someone who's actually dying.
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I'd love to speak to this. People who are dying want to be remembered just as much as we want to remember them. So one of the things that we can do in support of someone who knows that they're dying is to inquire about their legacy. What do they want to be remembered for? We have to also be willing to have those discussions, which can be hard, but it's a very meaningful gift that we can give that person. And I'll jump in just quick with like a quick personal story or example about this. But when my father was receiving home hospice care, someone who he worked very closely with came to our home and recorded a video of him giving his artist statement. And so that became such a treasure for my family. And so I really want to encourage you, if you are in a position where you're supporting someone who is dying, be willing to go there with them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, and Allison, I think this one would be one for you, from Sarah. She says, are there any hands-on activities that I can do with a young griever to help them understand and navigate their emotions?
Yeah, I mean, we have like a whole slew of them. I don't know how young is young, but one of the things that we like to do, one of our favorite ones in-house is we make a mask, and we invite the kids to write on the outside of the mask what they want to share about their grief, or what do they share about their grief with their friends. And then we invite them to flip the masks over and write on the inside what they don't tell anyone about their what feelings they don't share with their friends or family. And I think for a parent, this might be a very powerful, art assignment, because you might get an inkling on what's really going on. And like we said before, don't shy away from, participating in these play activities, these coloring activities with your child. So, you can kind of make your own mask too, to share and see. It might be interesting to see if you're on the same page. Even in my own journey, I got handed 1,000 journals. I think everyone that came to my house handed me a journal. And the last thing I really wanted to do, I mean, I was really kind of not in any shape to form words, let alone write them down. So I have a little bit of a Sharpie obsession. I'm going to admit it here. So I took all my Sharpies and I drew whatever kind of image came to me that day. And what ended up happening, and I left it on the table, it was there, it was kind of my thing. I would, lose the whole day coloring. But, my boys would ask what it was and I would tell them. And what was really interesting is at the time, my youngest, who was 11, was having a really hard time And, I didn't ask them every time they cried. I didn't want to be asked every time I cried. But when he was crying like back to back, then I kind of said, I really don't know what's going on with you today. I see a lot of tears. I'd love to know what's happening. Can you share? And he's like, I can't explain it, but I could show you. I'm like, okay. And he ran to my book and he flipped through the pages and he showed me my picture. And he's like, I feel this. And I said, oh my gosh, I understand this. And what was great for him is that he knew I understood it because he saw my picture. So it was kind of a great springboard, if you will, to just A, knowing we're on the same page, but B, having that dialogue. So wherever you can, try to get on, we've been saying it all along, but that's just a concrete example of, try to get on the same page and meet that child at that level with an arts and crafts. And there's, again, I say it at the end, but there are resources out there that offer, I might be hitting the wrong age here, but there are tons of resources and activities, online to do with children. So around too.
So we have just 5 more minutes remaining in this webinar, and we're going to try and get to 2 quick questions. Wow. All of the resources that Caitlin and Allison have mentioned today will be listed on the Adams House website. As a reminder, we are going to have an encore presentation of this webinar at noon. So let me just get to 2 final questions. This one from Mark, he says, I found it very comforting when a friend brings up a memory or a story of someone that I lost. How early in the grieving process is it okay for me to start sharing stories about a loved one to a person in grief? Is there a timeline to that?
I can speak to that. What might feel too early to one griever might not be too early to another. I think it's great that, you're able to recognize that was helpful to you. Like Allison mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to ask. Hey, I was thinking about this story about your person. Are you in a place where you want to hear it? And they might not take the bait that day, and that's okay. It's nothing personal. Maybe down the road, they want to hear that story, or maybe they want to hear the story on the spot, but don't be afraid to ask or assess their comfort level with that.
Yeah, because even if they say no, they still walk away with like, that was so nice, Mark remembered my person. And, look, a griever, this is why it's a little difficult for the supporter of a grieving person, because, some days we want to unplug from the grief and we don't want to go there and we want to be distracted. And you're my funny person. Excuse me. You're my funny person. I just want you to show up and be funny and distract me from the pain that I've been, wallowing in for the last day. And then there are other times where I do need you to listen to me. So it is really important to just take your cues from the griever and what they need, that companioning model. Learn and listen.
And one final question from Olga. She says, my husband's 3rd anniversary of his passing is quickly coming up, and his birthday is tomorrow. The summer is always such an emotional time for me. I'm finding myself more anxious than ever. I try to celebrate his life and keep the memories alive, but it brings more tears. How do I find a happy medium between keeping his memory alive, but somehow moving forward?
Yeah. I have a couple of things here.
Yeah.
I know Olga, so I'll say a quick hello. What's interesting to me about Olga's question, and it kind of speaks to, society and timelines and, I have to say, like, it's 8 years for me. And that first week in May, I could tell you every single thing I did 8 years ago. And that week is just a hotbed of anxiety and emotions, and I'm crying. And look, she has 2 things happening. So, I think what sits with me is like, again, we put this unfair timeline on our grief, and it sounds like Olga's like maybe a little annoyed at herself that she has this anxiety and she's emotional, and it's 3 years in. It's 3 years in grief speak is still really early, and she might have things to figure out. And then on top of everything, we've had this virus that is anxiety inducing. So some of this is probably looking at her angelversaries, and those are always hard when they're coming up, and how you're going to honor it. And it sounds like she is doing some of that too. But be okay with it's 3 years. Give yourself permission to be still emotional 3 years. You miss your person, and it hurts that he's not here, and that's still okay. Caitlin, I don't know if you want to speak to the anxiety piece and maybe when
Sure.
it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely if anxiety on some level is interfering with, our daily life and that thing, it's certainly something to address. But I do want to speak to just normalizing the tears and letting them flow. And one thing that I share often with the people who I work with is that, when we move something out, like when we're crying, we're moving a feeling out, but then we make space for something else. Okay. So it's like a cycle. You can keep his memory alive and still move forward. Okay. So it's kind of like that both and. My clients will hear me talk about the both and a lot. Sometimes these two opposing feelings, we can hold them simultaneously. One doesn't have to be at the expense or exclusion of the other. And that's where some self-compassion really comes into play. Let yourself feel both. They can coexist. Okay. And certainly, like you said, Allison, let's take that timeline right off of it. Okay. You're evolving with your grief. Okay. So it might feel like you're in the same spot one day, but you're at that spot with a different set of tools and more experience and more time. Okay. So bear in mind that both and.
Yeah.
Well, I think we could go on for another hour, right? This hour went really quickly, but we are really grateful for the conversation that we've had today. I know I've learned a lot today. Our thanks to Allison Wysota and to Caitlin Iannucci for sharing their insight, their perspective on dealing with loss and grief. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us on our live stream. Once again, to get in touch with Allison and Adam's House, please visit our website, www.adamshousect.org. And as a reminder, we will have an encore presentation of this webinar on our website today. So please tell your friends and colleagues to join that encore presentation and continue the conversations. And once again, thank you all for being part of Good Grief Connecticut.